Hi, I'm Anna.
I'm Maya.
I'm Elon.
We are Johns Hopkins medical students, and we're part of a team that's developed a set of resources to complement the human anatomy course.
This e-lecture will provide context on the historical and ethical foundations for the use of cadavers and anatomical dissection in medical education. We also hope to show how these considerations may impact the student's personal laboratory experience.
We hope you enjoy hearing from researchers, students, faculty, and Baltimore City leaders on this remarkable topic.
For the first section of this video, we will discuss the history of anatomical dissection in the Western medical tradition. By the end of this section, we hope you will appreciate the impact of race, class, and changing cultural norms on cadaveric procurement in America. We also hope to illustrate how this history continues to influence present-day practices in anatomical dissection for medical education. Anatomical dissection is well known as a rite of passage for Western medical students during their first year. However, for much of the history of medicine, anatomical education was not considered necessary or even relevant to medical training. As anatomy became a standard and important part of medical school curricula, a problem also arose. How could a sufficient number of cadavers be obtained for instruction? The various answers to this problem of cadaver procurement over the course of the past 250 years shape our modern-day experience of anatomical dissection and the relationship between student and cadaver in today's medical school gross lab. The anatomical basis of disease is a relatively new concept. In ancient medicine, disease was theorized as generalized imbalance in the body system, not as arising from isolated diseased organs. This concept of balance is reflected in the writings of Hippocrates and in the four humors theory of Galen, who was one of Hippocrates' most prolific disciples. In this sense, anatomical dissection was, for the most part, actually not useful to medicinal practices in the ancient world, which were focused on restoring balance to the whole body rather than analyzing the workings of its parts. The European physician Andreas Vesalius, born in 1514, is widely regarded as the first modern anatomist. Vesalius was well known in his time for the public dissection of the corpse of an executed felon and for the publication of an intricately illustrated work on the fabric of the human body, which was one of the first anatomical atlases based on dissection and observation of an actual corpse. The 16th century English physician William Harvey followed in Vesalius's footsteps and was one of the first doctors to draw physiological conclusions from anatomical observation. He based a theory of the circulation of blood on his investigation of the heart and vessels in both a cadaver and a living body. In the early modern world, cadaveric material was often obtained in the form of executed criminals and was used for public display or scientific investigation rather than teaching. Bodies chosen for dissection were also almost universally male. The practice of using executed criminals as the only legal source of cadavers for dissection continued well into the 18th century. However, by the end of the 18th century, medical schools were rapidly growing in size and number throughout the newly founded United States of America, and new, increasingly standardized medical school curricula placed a higher emphasis on anatomical dissection in medical education. The demand for cadavers greatly outpaced the supply of criminal bodies, causing anatomists and medical students to turn to other sources for human remains. Thus, under-the-table approaches developed in American cities with major medical schools such as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Various strategies included the bribing of gate guards at pauper cemeteries so that they would turn a blind eye to the resurrection of certain corpses, and concerted, although still illegal, efforts by city officials to segregate bodies into two groups, those most likely to be missed by friends or relatives, and those whose absence might go unnoticed.
A lot of the bodies that people are getting for dissection get taken from graves, and they target the bodies of the poor, the marginalized, and particularly African Americans, particularly enslaved bodies as well, because no one will sort of ask questions if they go missing. One of the goals of anatomy and dissection, especially in the 19th century, is locating racial difference and understanding, are there fundamental differences between the bodies of black people and the bodies of white people, the bodies of the poor and the bodies of the rich, because there's a lot of sort of ideas that certain characteristics, levels of intelligence, physical features, all of these things are embedded in sort of racial ideas. And so trying to sort of find and flesh out and discover what those differences really are in the physical body is a big part of why people are doing anatomy. But this relationship becomes even more complicated once you have African Americans entering the medical profession, becoming physicians, becoming nurses, moving into different medical specialties, establishing their own hospitals and other kinds of medical institutions. Is basically over the 19th century and basically the long 20th century, that relationship is complicated by the ways in which people can move in and out of the medical system and how much agency and autonomy people have in engaging or not engaging in particular medical practices. Grave robbing is one of the reasons that you see a lot of public unrest and public outcry against the practice of anatomy and dissection, because people sort of find out either through their own experiences with people that they know, or anecdotally, or through rumors and myth and sort of folklore that circulates, they begin to resist this idea, and they riot at medical schools. And so there's a particularly famous riot in 1882 in Philadelphia, where African Americans come to find out that a number of bodies have been taken from an African American burial ground.
By the early 19th century, the difficulty of obtaining corpses for dissection and the increasing number of body-snatching scandals necessitated legislative action. Between 1830 and 1831, Massachusetts passed a series of anatomy acts, and other states soon followed this example. This new legislation provided for the use of unclaimed bodies, mostly from prisons, asylums, and state hospitals, for medical education.
There are anatomy laws passed in a number of states because of concerns about grave robbing, especially when elite white people's graves are robbed for the sake of getting cadavers for doing dissections. But as far as poor people, people of color, the marginalized, they are sort of excluded from the enforcement of the anatomy laws. So there's almost no legal protection in place. And particularly for slaves, which in the South, the bulk of the cadavers are actually from the enslaved, they have no protection under the law as living people. So as dead people, they have even less. One particular case that Harriet Washington writes about in her book Medical Apartheid is the body of Addie Mae Collins, who was one of the 4 girls who was killed when a Birmingham church was bombed in the 60s. And she was buried in a African American cemetery because in the 60s a lot of places, including cemeteries in the South, were still segregated. And so her family actually, because the cemetery sort of goes into decline and it's in disrepair, they go to exhume her body and have it moved to a different cemetery. They open the casket and they find that her body is not there. And the immediate conclusion that people draw is that it must have been snatched by these grave robbers to do anatomy at Southern medical schools. Another incident was with the Medical College of Georgia. When they were doing repairs on one of the older buildings, they actually go in the basement and they find in the floor of the facility that there are these bodies of people that can't. They find I think about 9,000 different pieces of human remains that remain unidentified. But again, people linked it back to this practice of grave robbing. A lot of the ways that people, particularly people of color, have a problem with anatomy dissection in the 19th and early 20th century is rooted in this practice of grave robbing, and then this idea of grave robbing that sort of makes its way into myth and into rumor changes people's perceptions about what the practice is designed to do.
While early anatomy acts were frequently repealed, in one form or another, the spirit of these laws is still in place today in many states. In places like Maryland, early anatomy laws have been reinforced with greater protections for minorities and the poor through the creation of anatomy boards which oversee procurement and distribution of cadavers.
Well, it was created by law in 1947, and it was creating the anatomy board as part of the health department, part of state government. That's the first thing it did. The second thing it did, it said on a statewide basis, any body that is to be buried at the public's expense would be under the exclusive control and custody of the anatomy board given certain time periods and certain circumstances. So what it did, it provided for a statewide disposition of a body. Prior to that, there were 2 medical schools, Hopkins and Maryland, and they had the authority over unclaimed bodies in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. But in the subdivisions, it really didn't count. Like I said, the counties had their own, say, burial funds.
Whole body donation, the most common source of anatomical material in medical education today, was not fully legalized in America until the latter half of the 20th century. The 1968 Uniform Anatomical Gift Act passed in the wake of the first heart transplant, allowed individuals to stipulate that their organs could be used for transplantation after their death. This federal law meant to streamline the confusing mix of legislation drastically different state by state that pertained to the use of dead bodies in medical care, research, and education.
The idea of anatomical gift didn't really start in Maryland until '62, and that came about primarily as a result of corneal transplants, kidney transplants, and the whole idea that there would be tissues that would be suitable for transplantation to advance someone's health and well-being. There was a Maryland Anatomical Gift Act in 1962. When you talk about a uniform law, that's the federal uniform law. Uniform Gift Act is federal. The idea of that is to have some coherence among all the states from an ethical standard and from a legal standard.
While it seems that anatomical dissection has come a long way from body snatching and bribery, some anthropologists and ethicists argue that the current system remains exploitative, particularly of individuals with limited financial means. In a classic work, The American Way of Death, Jessica Mitford demonstrated the rising cost of funerals in modern America. Many families that cannot easily afford a funeral may turn to anatomical donation as a way to cover the costs of the preparation and disposal of their loved one's remains. While anatomical dissection currently remains a cornerstone of medical education in America, it was not always viewed as a necessary part of the curriculum, and it is possible that it will be phased out in future years. Some argue that virtual technologies have the potential to replace cadaveric dissection, while others feel that the hands-on experience of working with the body and viewing death up close is an essential part of learning to be a doctor. Ultimately, the complicated history of anatomical dissection and its role in medical education provides a window into social and political forces shaping the practice of medicine. Cadaveric dissection is also an opportunity for students to reflect personally on their role as future medical providers for people with a diverse set of identities, values, and beliefs.
So I think for a medical student, I think it would be really important to, when you're in an anatomy lab and you have your cadaver, to just think critically about what it means that you get to, learn with another human being's body. That there is a lot of sort of underlying issues with the ways in which people think about what happens with not only the bodies of the dead, but also with the bodies of the living in the medical profession, and thinking about why certain groups of people may be underrepresented in or overrepresented, in probably in some cases, in the specimens that you get to use. So just be aware of this fraught history, and hopefully, this little snippet will help you to be more respectful and mindful of who's on the table.
Now that you've learned some history, let's talk about ethics. By the end of this second section, you should be able to apply basic principles of medical ethics to questions surrounding the use of cadavers in anatomical dissection. You should be able to explain differences between donated and unclaimed cadavers, and you should be able to begin reflecting on how ethical thinking might impact your lab dissection experience and your training as medical professionals. In the first section, you learned how the Anatomy Acts of the mid-1800s tried to resolve the problem of grave robbery by allowing use of unclaimed bodies for dissection, and how eventually the Anatomical Gift Acts of the mid-1900s created systems for people to donate their bodies as well. So let's review. Where do we stand today?
In Maryland, there are essentially two sources. There are bodies where the person has donated him or herself in life to the Maryland Anatomy Board and all the institutions that are supported by that. And the other situation is where you have an unclaimed body, someone who has died and no family member has claimed that person for disposition.
In your anatomy lab, you will work with one of these cadavers, a body that some may describe as your first patient.
Thinking about the cadaver as our first patient is, I think, useful in terms of how we show respect to the cadaver, to the body, and to the wishes that brought that cadaver to be in front of us.
So how do we approach ethics in medicine? Well, generally, we start with Tom Beauchamp's and James Childress's idea of the four principles.
A lot of modern medical ethics, and bioethics in particular, is centered around this philosophical set of principles known as the four, quote-unquote, four principles. Not everyone sort of ascribes to these as ways to think about ethical problems, but it is a very, very common framework that's used. The four principles that you will hear a lot about and are often spoken about are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And they're, as you can imagine, very interlinked. Autonomy, when we think about somebody's autonomy, it's their right of self-determination and self-governance, their ability to make affirmative or negative choices about how their life will go, about how their bodies are used, about how their information is used. When we think about beneficence in the medical context, we're thinking about maximizing the good that can come to an individual person who's getting medical care. So basically, any medical intervention that is contemplated should be to the benefit of that person or maybe a group or society to which that person belongs. This is linked very closely to the principle of non-maleficence. You've often heard of do no harm, primum non nocere. Non-maleficence is sort of the principle that in medical care or in clinical research, experimental trials, any harm to the patient should be avoided. Not at all costs necessarily. Sometimes harm can be outweighed by benefits, and sometimes somebody can voluntarily consent to harm. But in general, we should avoid harming people in the context of medical care. And then when we think about justice, justice applies to groups and to populations more broadly. And the idea here is that different groups, different populations with different characteristics should be, to the extent possible, treated equitably and fairly when medical care is given, in terms of how the benefits and burdens of medical care, of finances, of different goods in society are distributed. In general, people should be treated without discrimination or bias.
With this foundation in mind, let's think through the ethics of cadaver acquisition and use. Though before we dive in, we should consider one important caveat, that is, that ethics for the dead are not necessarily the same as ethics for the living.
There are very interesting philosophical or normative debates about whether somebody's rights or somebody's interests actually exist beyond their death, and if they do, to what extent, as ethicists, as medical professionals, we need to take them into account and balance them against other interests, against medical education, against research, and against what society, how society might benefit.
There may be no one in Maryland who has to consider this balance more often than Ron Wade, director of the State Anatomy Board of Maryland. Let's say I want to donate my body.
I'll get the forms. We'll have you sign. He can witness. I can witness. We're good.
So how does Mr. Wade approach the ethics of cadaver acquisition?
From my point of view, I'm here to support anyone who needs to advance their knowledge, their healthcare delivery skills and expertise to advance the public health and advance the living people.
That doesn't mean that the dead body itself isn't important. On the contrary, respecting the body is part of comforting and honoring the living relatives of the deceased.
It also has a duty to promote the dignity and respect of that decedent individual, to advance the well-being of the family, health and well-being of the family, in addition to the study use of the body, and to assure that the final disposition is done in a legal, ethical, and dignified way.
Ultimately, though, Mr. Wade's main goal for the State Anatomy Board is to provide cadaveric resources where they are most needed, through public oversight.
My duty and obligation is to, from the donation you've made at the time of death, given the circumstances and the cause of death, is to use your body to serve the greatest good.
So we start to see that the principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, and to some extent justice seem to emerge as guiding principles for the State Anatomy Board. How about our first principle, autonomy? Well, it turns out that for donated bodies at least, autonomy is a big priority.
You have the right to treat your body as your property, and that's been true since the Anatomic Gift Act of Maryland. That's the milestone of that law was that the rights and entitlement to your disposition didn't just belong to the family and the next of kin, but to you, because you can treat your body as your property.
One of the interesting things about Maryland law is that you cannot donate your next of kin. So you have to donate yourself and be of sound mind to do so.
It's a very simple process. It's two very brief paragraphs. One is the intent of the donation, two is the authority, and then it's your signature and two witnesses, and then if there's a place at the bottom of the form where if you want your cremated remains to go to someone, you can list that. Otherwise, we would inter in our state gravesite. And the only one that can cancel that donation would be you, not me.
So there seem to be solid ethical foundations for the practice of donating bodies. This was part of the drive behind the Anatomical Gift Acts of the 1960s in the first place. But what about unclaimed bodies?
If someone an individual has no estate, they have no insurance. There's no will that says who is going to control the disposition. Who are they going to say is going to take care of this?
When somebody dies and either a family member cannot be located or cannot afford to take possession of that body for whatever reason, the body is considered unclaimed by the state.
We're like the court of last resort. If no one comes in to take care of the fellow, then the state will. Ultimately, the state's going to have to do something to protect the state and the public health. But we're going to do it in a manner in which, number one, we're going to have the economical and efficient use of state funds in doing it, but there's also going to be, since there's public funds used, that it's going to advance the public health interest.
Unclaimed bodies make up about a third of the cadavers that come to Maryland Anatomy Labs through the State Anatomy Board. Use of these cadavers for medical training is supported by ethical principles like beneficence and serving the public good, but some ethicists have grappled with the issue of autonomy.
And one of the questions is, what about consent? What about the person's wishes beyond death? And is this something that they would wish to happen to their bodies after they're dead? And on that issue, I think we might each have our own answers.
There is a consent. Under the law, no one has come forward. Ultimately, someone has to take responsibility for the disposition of the body. There's no other state in the United States that has a death system, a system that takes care of decedent bodies like the state of Maryland. A person is a veteran entitled to veterans burial. We'll make sure that he gets to a veterans cemetery with military honors and he's interred where he has every right to be interred for the service to his country. So it is a very public sensitive kind of program.
On one hand, there are benefits to society. These medical students, you are getting the benefit of that knowledge of being taught to practice medicine. On the other hand, we don't know very much about that person's life story, about what they would have wanted and whether this is something they would or would not have wanted.
It's hard to know what the person wanted if they didn't leave a will and if no next of kin claimed them. And so when faced with the choice of what to do with that body, the state could say all of them should be cremated, all of them should be buried, all of them should be used for medical training. And any of those options chosen by the state could be against the wishes of the decedent.
That there are multiple opinions on this topic is no surprise. There will always be debate in the field of ethics, and some issues may never be resolved. But as students of anatomy, inside the lab and out, we need to push ourselves to continue the discussion.
You are intentionally or unintentionally part of this process. You are the recipient of this body donation and the information that comes with it. So you are implicitly endorsing the entire process that brings that cadaver to you.
That process is complex and multi-layered, and ethicists will continue to discuss the implications of cadaver use as one of the myriad ethical questions within the world of medical practice. At the heart of every discussion, though, is a return to how principles affect real people, and an attempt to understand how to best respect the autonomy of each individual while doing good, avoiding harm, and seeking justice.
There's definitely a debate within bioethics about whether the reason we think of a cadaver as the first patient is because of that person's respect for that person while they were still living, or whether it's more out of respect for their families that still exist and wanting to be respectful to their wishes, or more towards sort of a societal ideal and sort of thinking about if we were in that position, how would we want to be treated?
You will be in a position as a professional to teach others and to influence the way that these things actually happen in your jurisdiction. So you should know.
I used to survey. I used to teach classes in sociology, psychology, and stuff, and we used to survey the donors. And I haven't done that probably in about 15 years, but at that time, predominantly most donors were female. Most donors were at least a high school education. Most donors had family, and it wasn't being done for economic reasons. The idea that it's the legacy they're leaving that will promote life.
In this final section, we'll explore how the historical and ethical dimensions of anatomical dissection may influence the student's personal experience in the course. By the end of this section, we hope you'll be able to appreciate the instinct to both humanize and dehumanize a cadaver, and that you'll be alert to how your preferences may differ from your classmates. Finally, we hope you'll be able to speak with your peers about respectful treatment of cadavers, to identify moments where that might be challenging, and to support each other through that process. For students, dissection of the human body is a rite of passage into the medical professions. It is an extraordinary, intense, and rewarding experience. That personal experience can intersect with the history and ethics of anatomical donation in complex ways. For example, who are the cadavers in your anatomy lab?
You may look around and see a variety of different bodies, men, women, on the thinner side, on the slightly larger side, but you may be sort of wondering, am I getting sort of the full representation of different races, different ages? Maybe there are certain types of diseases that rule out particular patients from being able to donate their bodies to research.
You might wonder, how did these cadavers come to be in your lab? Did they voluntarily donate their bodies, or were they unclaimed bodies at the time of their death, who were then transferred to the state anatomy board?
And on the last day of anatomy, they reveal the age of your cadaver and the cause of death. And my cause of death was pretty suspect. It was schizophrenia, which is not a disease that people die of. And so that made me feel pretty strongly that it was a high chance that my body was unclaimed. And it was really uncomfortable for me, especially because on the first day of anatomy, like the overwhelming feeling beyond being nervous and, being worried about fainting or anything like that was, I just felt so grateful. Like I was almost moved to tears that first day because I was like, someone gave their body for me to learn from, and that really moved me. And so I felt like that was taken away from me.
I don't know where I fall in the kind of debate over whether unclaimed bodies should be used for anatomy or just cremated and given a state burial. There's some beauty in that and poetry in this person had no one. We couldn't find anyone for them. And now, at least at Hopkins, they have a group of 6 people who will always remember them and always be thankful to them. And that means something to me.
Students get to know the cadaver that they're working on and become curious about the person whose body that is. And so eventually you start to ask questions about what was this person's life like, and I think that in that line of inquiry you start to wonder about how they got from perhaps being in a hospital or hospice or in their home to the point where they're in the lab and you're learning about their body. I think it's good. I think it's a good process.
It can be challenging to know how to best navigate your reflections about the cadaver and its role in your education. Do you imagine the individual and their life to humanize them and feel grateful to a person? Or do you try to avoid thinking of the cadaver as a person to focus on the cadaver as a tool for your learning, which is why it was donated in the first place? Every student will have their own answers to these questions and may feel different emotions as they reflect on their cadaver day by day.
There's no way you can really anticipate how you're going to feel or what the experience is going to be like when you actually do, come into the anatomy lab and you start to uncover the bags and remove the shroud. So it was a bit difficult because I had all these thoughts in my head. This was a person before.
I think for me, I'm Jewish, and in Judaism you don't have open casket anything. So I had family members that had passed, but I've never actually seen a dead body before. And I think that allowed me maybe to ease into the seeing this body as a cadaver that I was learning from versus a person that had been. I think I still maintain the respect, like this was a person at some point, but I was able to depersonalize it a little more because I had never had an experience before.
When I got there, I felt terrible because in the moment while they were like undraping the cadaver, I kind of like felt nothing, right? Like it was just like blank, right? And I was like staring at this body, and I remember just thinking, why am I like not feeling stronger emotions right now? I'd expected to feel stronger emotions, but I didn't. And I think it was only later at night when I was trying to go to bed that I like kept thinking about seeing this cadaver's face.
So I just remember the first day I was just like, don't lock your knees, just keep breathing. It was like just what I kept saying to myself. But by the end of the first lab, like we met our cadaver, everything went really well, and like my group was really great.
It's really funny you say that because there was a moment that first day where I was saying, don't lock your knees. And I was someone who was really, really excited about anatomy.
I didn't want everyone's first impression, especially this group that I was going to be dissecting with for weeks and weeks, to be like the girl that cries in anatomy. And then as I talked to people about it, like I was definitely not the only one who felt that way, and definitely not the only one who was in tears or close to on the first day, and knowing that made me feel more comfortable expressing that I had some strong emotions on that first day.
One of the things that medical students try to do in the anatomy course, because it's kind of their first experience interacting with each other and with staff, is they try to go towards a normal reaction. They're trying to act appropriately. And so the outward reaction might actually be different than the inward reaction. You are a little bit open about how you're feeling, and you leave some space for the other people to express themselves. And not judging, I think, is very important. Listening to what somebody says and thinking about what is it like to be that person and to have their experiences before you apply some kind of a value judgment to what they're saying.
You should be aware that your feelings may evolve as the course goes on.
Students have said that they felt that they've sort of gotten a good handle on the emotional aspects of dissecting once they're well underway, and then they're surprised that they start a new part of the body and it has a strong emotional effect sort of out of the blue, whether it's the hands or the face, and that's entirely normal. And I just encourage you to, ask for the support of your friends around the table to help you if you're having a bad day.
And if you are excited and thrilled by a dissection, enjoy it. That is the wonderful part of this course.
And this person kind of felt bad because this person didn't have a strong emotional reaction. They were thrilled with the science, but not really moved in the heart. They were worried that this was a sign of not being empathetic, and that's okay. It was just different experiences, right?
So medical students are processing their own reactions to working with a cadaver. At the same time, students want to recognize the cadaver as a person too, to respect the person whose body was donated to the lab, to respect the cadaver. That's not always as easy as we'd like.
Now, how do you manage that respect and balance it with your own emotional well-being and having a good time in lab and getting to know your colleagues?
None of us is able to always be at our best, and during stressful times, sometimes we aren't always able to demonstrate the behaviors that we hope we would demonstrate all the time.
Had some challenges in preserving treating the cadaver with respect and preserving the dignity of the cadaver as we rotated it. One of our group members at one point said, I'd like to just pause for a moment, and I'd like to do this, rather than rush it. Let's just take a moment, think about how we're going to do this, and make sure we can, kind of preserve the dignity. And I was so grateful to her for just kind of calling a little brief timeout.
All of us, when we begin our medical training, we're in a completely new environment. It's really unclear sometimes what exactly the expectations are in terms of our own behaviors, like what can we say, how much is funny, how much sort of crosses the line. If you make a misstep, let's say you say something, you're trying to be funny and it's not funny to other members of your group, that you realize quickly that it would be wise to apologize and understand the impact that it had on others and learn from that. And don't feel guilty or ashamed about it, because this is really a learning process and you're really depending on your peers to help you with that. And it's bi-directional. What I mean is that if you're around the table and you hear something that troubles you, that someone else said either in jest or maybe there's some tensions brewing, it is important to give feedback.
Here are 2 examples of situations a student might encounter in a lab. Let's say you're dissecting the pelvis, which is a pretty strange process, and a classmate makes a joke about a cadaver's genitalia. How could you respond? I know this is a pretty strange situation, but I find it uncomfortable to refer to our cadaver's penis that way. While we're in lab, could we stick to anatomical terms? Or perhaps somebody wants to take a picture of their lab group standing by the dissecting table. You could try something like, "You all look great in scrubs and the lab is a great backdrop, but I'm worried that it's disrespectful to our cadavers to have that kind of picture taken in lab. Could the group take the picture outside of the lab, maybe by the anatomy diagrams?" So it's a combination of normalizing the situation, speaking from your own experience, and making a suggestion or asking a question.
So much of what we do is in a team, not just as a medical student, but as a physician, that these are skills that we practice regularly. There will be missteps by all of us. There will also be missteps in the feedback process. And so there's this sort of iterative process of trying and being open to improvement and empathy and compassion for your partners that are learning as well.
And I think most classmates will be open to hearing things like that, even if, like you said, you weren't particularly thinking about that. But I think that most of the group would be open.
One of the things that the team will face as they start working on the cadaver and the dissection is how they want to handle what kind of, if you will, ground rules the team wants to have about how they work together.
One of my lab mates printed out this article about naming their cadavers, and they had talked about in that article about how people would dehumanize their cadavers by giving them a new name. By doing this, you're not meaning for it to be hurtful, but it could be, and so having that article as a common reading was so helpful to get us on the same page.
In general, there are a few principles to be aware of.
Regardless of how we feel about the metaphysical state of the cadaver, there is potentially identifying information in the cadaver, and we're obliged to maintain confidentiality about that. So no pictures. That is a full-on rule. Making a joke about the anatomy of a cadaver is a little bit like making a joke about the anatomy of a friend who isn't present. It's a little unfair. They can't do anything about it, and they can't say anything about it. So I would discourage making a joke about the anatomy of the cadaver. Making jokes around the cadaver about other things, I think, is totally fine. And being curious about the life of the person whose cadaver it is, totally fine. I think that's natural, to be curious and to remark on things like anatomical variation and pathology. I think that that's just fine. Some say don't say anything about the cadaver or think about the cadaver in a way that would feel inappropriate if it were a loved one, like a grandmother or grandfather. That might be a good rule of thumb.
Other questions your group may want to discuss as part of the first days or even throughout the course are, should a cadaver be named or nicknamed? Should you refer to the cadaver as him or her or it? When or how is it appropriate to comment on a body part, like the size of someone's breast versus the size of someone's liver? And you'll likely imagine your cadaver's life based on their appearance, their size, race, age, tattoos, nail polish, calluses. It's natural. But is it ever problematic? Well, just ask yourself, what might your ideas be telling you about bias or stereotyping? So can you or your group challenge ideas about how this person might have been? And then finally, if your cadaver is really distinctive, so for example, if they have unique tattoos, how careful do you need to be about describing that person to others? Is there a risk that they could be identified by someone who overhears you?
When you start anatomy, it will happen very fast, and you will focus in on the details of anatomy and what you have to learn and what you have to recollect. Very quickly, you'll get into that. And my advice would be, if you can, try to slow yourself down a little bit. Slow down that process of narrowing in on what is vitally important for your success, and try to drink in what's happening around you. Absorb a little bit of the experience, because that is what you will remember. You might remember all of the details of the innervation of the upper limb, but you might not. And you can go back and read those things in a textbook. What you should internalize is the experience, because it is a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
We hope that you enjoyed this video and found it informative.
Our goal has been to spark discussions between lab mates and peers, and to lay the groundwork for ongoing personal reflection throughout the course.
Enjoy the privilege of participating in this unique experience, and don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you'd like to continue the discussion.